Thank you. Just as a reminder, if you want to sit further to the front, please do so. I don't think there will be that many, so feel free to be seated near to the front. So now we're changing theme. We were in the previous sessions looking at the use of PISA in terms of improving school level practices. Now we moved back to policy. And in this session, we will be looking at particularly a certain type of policies around related to equity, so targeted policies to improve equity. And Annabella will be moderating again, so thank you. And over to you.
So thank you. I will call my presenters. We'll have 3 papers. So we are already, no, it's 3. 3 papers. 3 papers. And I was already said that I need to stick with the schedule. So we had times for questions. So I asked Emily Frank and Itibas Nikes. I hope I said it well. Lorraine Guilhesh. And now is the tough ones. Kreyog Patrawart and Irashati Kelotong. I hope I did it well. So let me just start by presenting right away the first presenters. So Emily Frank is a PhD candidate at HIVA, Research Institute for Work and Society. And she's working with Idebas Nikes, which is a senior research manager at HIVA, as well as a professor of education and society at the Department of Education Science of the University of Leuven. He is specialized in social policy, more precisely the relationships between education, labor market policy, and social inclusion. And they will presenting about the priority policies for inequity. Please.
Hello, everybody. So I'm Emily, and I will present something about do educational priority policies reduce educational inequity, and I will examine 3 education systems. So first of all, ensuring equal educational opportunities is kind of a shared objective around the world. However, and to do that, many countries have implemented educational priority policies. There are several definitions of what exactly these policies are, but most often I stick to the one made by the MUSE, which says that these are policies designed to have an effect on educationally disadvantaged groups through systems or programs of focused action by offering something more to designated populations. However, despite these policies or efforts from education systems, improving educational equity remains a challenge. And that kind of brings often up the question on why some educational priority policies succeed better than others. And to respond to that question, it is quite important to compare not only just the policies, but really the focus, the scale, and the nature of each of the educational priority policies, as well as the characteristics and the structures of each education system. So that kind of brings us to the aim of the study, which is examining the effectiveness of 3 educational priority policies implemented in distinct education systems. More precisely, the Flemish Community of Belgium, which I refer to often as Flanders, Chile, and England. And more precisely, I will be investigating whether educational inequity has changed since the implementation of the educational priority policy. And hopefully that information allows us to gain insight into which educational priority policy, if any, has been effective, and potential factors that contribute to the varying effectiveness of educational priority policies. So as we all know, educational inequity can originate from various sources at different levels: student level, classroom level, school level, but also the system level. And because I'm looking at 3 distinct education systems, I want to make sure that I choose 3 education systems that are quite different in their structure. And so I used Mons typology for that, because Mons distinguishes 4 models based on 4 system level characteristics, which are tracking, ability grouping, grade retention, and individualized support. I only took 3 countries because of the 4th model. I couldn't find a country that fitted data or that was able to, that were really distinct educational priority policies. They had like a lot of small interventions, but not really a clear one. So without going too much into depth into each educational party policy, because that would take too much time, I'm just going to broadly go over the aim of each of the educational party policies that I'm examining. First of all, Flanders, which has the Act of Equal Education Opportunities. The aim for that was to ensure equal opportunities for all children to achieve their full potential, prevent exclusion, segregation, and discrimination, and promote social cohesion in primary and secondary schools in Flanders. It was implemented in 2002, and the way that schools get additional funding is based on student-level characteristics. In England, you have pupil premium, which was implemented in 2011, and the aim was to narrow the performance gap in mathematics and English between disadvantaged students and their peers in primary and secondary state-funded schools. And they also wanted to address the potential negative impact of social and economic segregation in school intake. Their additional funding that schools receive is also based on student-level characteristics. Oh, sorry, I forgot to click on the thing. The last country, Chile, which has the preferential school subsidy law, often referred to as SEP, was implemented in 2008. And the aim was to enhance student achievement and reduce income-based achievement gaps by providing like an additional voucher to priority students on top of the voucher that was already in place. And they also wanted to provide SEP concentration vouchers to schools based on the amount of disadvantaged students they were enrolled into a school. And in that way, the Chilean system provided additional funding to schools based on both student and school level characteristics. The data I used always multiple cycles of PISA. So I always use 2 cycles for each education system, one before the implementation date, one the latest one available, which is 2002. I imputed missing data and I used student and school weights. Data I used mathematics achievement as the dependent variable. And at the independent variables, I used several variables at student and school level. I think the most important thing is that I didn't use ESES because of the comparability issues over time. So instead, I decided to take the 2 components that were comparable over time, which is the index of highest occupational status of parents and the index of highest number of years of schooling of parents. And I made it comparable over years because there were some changes in the ISCO coding, for example, so I made it comparable annually. And then at the school level, I took the average of the ISEI and the paired variable. The method I used were 2-level hierarchical linear models for each education system, and I used it in conjunction with difference in difference methodology. So for the multi-level approach, I used non-standardized estimates, and I built my models in an iterative fashion. For the difference in difference, the idea was to estimate the impact of the educational party policy by comparing the outcomes of 2 groups, the targeted and non-targeted students or schools, at 2 different time points, one before and one after the implementation of the educational priority policy. And the targeted group would be exposed in the second time, but not in the first time point, while the non-targeted group would never be exposed to the priority policy. And to do that, to model it, I used a dummy variable representing the 2 time points and interacted it with my measures. It is quite important, I think, before I go to the results, that certain assumptions of the difference in difference technique are only partially fulfilled in this methodology. So the determinants of educational inequity used in our analysis to define target populations are just proxies, because often countries define their target population based on national data, which I didn't use, I used PISA data. Besides that, there is also several education systems, for instance, Flanders, that changed a little bit the indicators over time, and I did not account for that. The difference in difference methodology also assumes that educational priority policies will not have any effect on the control group, but sometimes, especially in this case, this assumption does not hold true because it's not always clear if only the targeted students are really reached or if all students are reached. And lastly, we can also not isolate the effect of educational priority policies completely from other measures, events, or shifts that occur during the time point that I'm researching. So if we look at some results, first of all, I will first go over the Flemish case. In general, when you look at some student level impacts with correlations, we started a positive correlation with student level ISEI, meaning that students with a higher ISEI perform better than those with a lower ISEI. Although the effect might seem small, it's actually not, because the scale goes from 13 until 89, so it's quite a big scale. Second of all, non-native speaker and immigrant students perform considerably lower than the native and non-immigrant students, which was expected. At the school level ISI also showed a positive correlation with mathematics performance. If you look at a trend between 2003 and 2022, we mostly saw actually that the achievement gap between non-immigrant and immigrant students declined. So in 2003, non-immigrant students outperformed students with migration background with 41.11 points, while in 2022, this is only by 12.11 points. So it's a decline of 29 points in mathematics achievement. So in general, some conclusions for the Flemish community would be that there's promising results in reducing student-level ethnic inequity, which is consistent with earlier findings. We did not see any impact on student-level socioeconomic inequity, despite it being one of the main target criteria in the Flemish community. But a potential explanation that's often been given is that schools in Flanders, they receive additional funding, but they don't really know who the target population is. So they have a hard time identifying who the disadvantaged students are. And often disadvantaged immigrant students are easier to identify than the native low SES students. If we look at Chile, at the student level, we see that there is no significant effect of language spoken at home and migration background on performance. We again see a positive correlation with student level ISI and mathematics performance. At the school level, we see a positive correlation with school level ISI. We see that private schools outperform public schools, and we see that a higher degree of school competition brings down the average mathematics performance. If you look at some shifts between 2006 to 2022, we can see that there is a decline in the positive correlation with student level ISI. So in 2006, an increase of 1 on the ISI scale was associated with an increase of 0.5 points in mathematics achievement. And in 2022, this was only associated with an increase of 0.21 points in mathematics achievement. So yeah, there is a decline in the correlation, which is a positive point. So some general conclusions are that it shows, again, also potential in reducing student-level inequity based on ISI, which is also consistent with other studies. And it kind of aligns with the target population, because in Chile, they mentioned that the target population is mostly the 40% poorest students based on the income distribution. However, despite also being explicitly focused on reducing school-level inequity, there was no significant change in the school-level inequities that we saw. But a potential explanation could be that there is a lot of segregation in Chile, and that there is also a high level of residential segregation. If we then turn to the English case, in general, we saw again a positive correlation with student-level ISI. And we saw that first-generation immigrant students performed worse than non-immigrant students. At the school level, we saw a positive correlation with school-level ISI, also with school-level pairs, so the average years of schooling. And we saw that a negative correlation with the proportion of first-generation immigrant students at school, meaning that schools with a high proportion of first-generation immigrant students, that they perform worse than other schools. If we look at shifts, it was a bit an interesting shift. So in 2009, attending schools with a high proportion of second-generation immigrant students was associated with lower mathematics performance, and this correlation completely shifted in 2022. It's not very surprising, because it is generally always, in several researchers point out that second-generation immigrant students outperform native students in England, but there's still inequity in a different way in that way. However, if we look at some general conclusions about England, we could say that pupil prima appears to have fallen short on its objectives based on our analysis. But when we did the same analysis also for 2018 and 2015. And based on those analyses, we always saw that there was a reduction in the ethnic and socioeconomic student level inequity. So it's a bit of a question now, maybe because of some negative effects of COVID, we don't see any effect with 2022. That would be something that should be investigated further. So some general conclusions, I think there are some indications that educational priority policies can be an effective tool in reducing inequity. And of course, there is varying and sometimes limited effectiveness, but this can be also attributed to several factors, such as external contextual influences, such as migration trends or socioeconomic shifts. They can have an impact on equity or inequity and make it challenging for those priority policies to really work as effective as possible. Also, the unclear or ineffective targeting. There's often a lack of precise identification groups and not having a clear idea of what your target group is as a system, but also as a school, it's very hard to make a policy very effective. And thirdly, also there's systematic causes of inequality, and a lot of policies are implemented without really addressing those causes. So if there's like a big degree of segregation at the system level, it's quite hard that one policy will reduce the inequity of the system if you don't address those root causes first. So some lessons for other PISA participating education systems is first of all to ensure transparent and up-to-date targeting. I think it's important to always make sure that you're really addressing the most significant inequalities and that you reevaluate it enough. You should also address those deeply rooted systematic structures because they have a quite detrimental impact on equity, and if you don't address them, it's hard for another policy to be effective. We should consider the broader social and cultural context. The challenges such as increasing multiculturalism or multilingualism, they introduce new complexities in the education system in the classroom, and they should also be taken into account. There should be awareness and accountability at the local level as well. So schools and communities should have tools to understand the inequities and also to implement proven effective strategies. And lastly, there should be a promotion of collaboration between stakeholders to encourage partnerships between schools, families, and the local communities to create like a kind of holistic approach to address inequity all around. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. I must say you were great on time. So I have to congrats on that. So the second paper is from Lorraine Gillish. Lorraine is a research fellow at the Educational Research Center in Dublin, where she is currently responsible for overseeing the work of educational disadvantage. But she's also very extensive experience with large scale educational assessments and surveys. So Lorraine, please.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak about Ireland's use of PISA data to support equity in education. So the rationale for using PISA data to inform policy for equity in education in Ireland is twofold. Firstly, we have a lack of administrative data to support policy monitoring and evaluation, and this has been recognised both in national commentary and internationally as well in a review conducted by the OECD of policy in this area. Particularly, we have a lack of student background data at the individual level, and we also have limited data on student achievement at the individual level, and this is a particular problem at primary level. On the other hand, using PISA data provides an international perspective that would not be available with national data alone. So it allows us to look at the achievements of our low SES students relative to low SES students internationally. So just by way of context, Ireland has strong performance in reading, mathematics and science, as well as in equity outcomes at primary and post-primary levels. We have a narrower socioeconomic gap in educational outcomes than on average across the OECD. Nonetheless, differences in outcomes persist for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. We have a strong history of pilot projects and initiatives to combat educational disadvantage at preschool, primary and post-primary levels. Since 2005, the Delivering Equality of Opportunity in Schools programme is the main policy response. We have had a significant expansion of DEIS, so DEIS is the Irish language word for opportunity, and we've had a significant expansion of this programme, so we now have almost a third of schools and about a quarter of students in DEIS. DESH schools receive additional resources with some variation between primary and post-primary level and by DESH band. So at primary level, the most disadvantaged urban schools are called DESH band 1. We have disadvantaged urban schools and then disadvantaged rural schools. But this banding doesn't exist at post-primary level. So in general, there's additional grant allocation, and in some bands at primary level and at post-primary level, DESH schools have access to a homeschool community liaison coordinator. So we had a national strategy for literacy and numeracy published in 2011 and an interim review of that in 2017. So that review found that some targets had been met, but there were persistent achievement gaps between students in DESH and non-DESH schools. So then specific targets based on PISA reading and mathematics were set for the percentages of students at various levels in PISA. So there were targets overall nationally and then targets specifically for students in DESH schools. So there were targets for those at or above level 4, the percentage at or above level 5, and the percentage at or below level 1. PISA 2015 served as the baseline, and the targets were for 2020 to coincide with the lifetime of the strategy. Now, originally PISA was scheduled for 2021, but ultimately was conducted in 2022. And the same targets were included in the 2017 revision of the DESH plan. So you may recall that I said that DESH was introduced in 2005, and then the plan was revised in 2017. At that time, national targets were set related to literacy and numeracy. As I said, these were based on PISA at post-primary level. They were targets for retention, student well-being, progression to further and higher education, teacher education, parental engagement, and community links. And in order to achieve the targets in the plan, including those related to PISA achievement, 5 goals were set. And I'm going to focus on 2 of those goals for the moment. So the first was to implement a more robust and responsive assessment framework for the identification of schools and for effective resource allocation. So specifically, what this meant was introducing a new way of identifying schools for DESH. And this was based on the HP Deprivation Index, which is a small area index. It's calculated from the census of the population, and on average, there's about 100 households in a small area. So for almost all our students, we have the HP index associated with their home address, and this can be aggregated to school level to get a school level indicator of disadvantage. Now, it was recognised in the 2017 DESH plan that there would be a need for ongoing analysis and research to support this new identification system, as well as the resource allocation process. The second goal in the DESH plan referred to improving the learning experience and outcomes of students in DESH schools. And it referred to things like supporting good practice and innovation, school planning, and school climate. So as you can see, both of these goals, PISA data, lend themselves to examining progress towards these goals. So specifically using data from PISA 2018, we examined achievement in DESH schools and progress towards literacy and numeracy targets. We also used the PISA 2018 to provide rich description of the home backgrounds and school experiences of students in DESH schools. And then thirdly, we used data from PISA 2018 to validate the deprivation index used to identify schools for DESH. And we looked at how school average ESCS, so the economic, social and cultural status measure, is associated with school average HP, which is our national deprivation index. And we also considered how school average ESCS is associated with percent fee waiver, which is a national variable used in earlier DESH identification approaches and also used as an implicit stratification variable in PISA for Ireland. Oh, sorry. So we had, So moving on to the achievement, we found some positive findings, so a significant reduction from 2012 to 2018 in the percentages of students classified as low achievers in mathematics. But we did find some issues with using PISA data for monitoring progress towards targets. So if you look here, the baseline for the percentage below level 2 was 21.8%. We didn't see any change in that percentage by PISA 2018, but you can see that with the confidence interval, the target is already in that. So just to skip on a little then, there were some specific issues. So the percentages generated by PISA are estimates that incorporate measurement and sampling error. We already had a low proportion of students performing below level 2, so it may be better to focus on lower achieving boys or higher achievers, particularly in maths or science. And specific PISA targets are not set in the most recent literacy and numeracy strategy. So there are broader indicators, and it indicates that it will draw on a wide set of data sources. I can skip over the PISA ESCS analysis for the sake of time. But in summary, there were strong correlations between the various measures that we examined, but we did suggest that there's a need for further analysis of schools with a mismatch between HP quintile and ESCS quintile. Note that our analysis predated some recent refinements to the DESH identification system. So obviously these weren't taken into account in our analysis. So in terms of lessons for PISA countries, PISA data allows for consideration of both educational inequality and educational disadvantage, whereas in Ireland, our national comparisons had typically been between DESH and non-DESH schools. It is important to think about the impact of sampling decisions, such as stratification variables. DESH is not used as a stratification variable in Ireland, which means that we get some variation in the percentages of students in DESH schools across PISA cycles. Also, we don't oversample for DESH, which means that we have comparatively large standard errors associated with the estimates for students in those schools. We also have some variation in response rates across cycles, and in the most recent cycle, there was some evidence of an upward bias within the respondent sample, and particularly an issue for students in DESH schools. It is important to think about if there are changes to the approach underpinning DESH over time. That makes comparisons more difficult. Then using PISA for national targets, it is important to consider the scope for improvement, as well as the fact that schools cannot assess their own progress, as well as the unavoidable error associated with PISA estimates, and then the alignment of national targets with PISA cycles. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for rushing you, but we actually are a little bit late in general. You have been doing this very good, but we want to have some time for questions. So the last paper will be from Cryos and T. Kiletong. Is about PISA for schools. So Cryos is the managing director of the Equity in Education Fund, and T. Kiletong is an associate professor in the School of Economics and the director of the Research Institute for Policy Evaluation and Design at the University of Thai Chamber of Commerce. So please, thank you.
Thank you, Annabella. In Thailand, we try to look at PISA as the monitoring tools for us to improve the education performance and the economic prosperity of the country. But as you can see from 2000, when we participate in PISA, we are in a bit of a decline in a number of subjects that you can see from this graph, particularly during 2018 to 2022. So that's not the only concern that we have. So if we look deeper in each subject, the portion of students who perform below level 2 are quite high, and 2/3 of these students who perform under the level 2 are disadvantaged in background, low ACS. So when we talked about PISA, you not only talked about the excellence of the education performance, we also talked about equity of your population. So we want to know how we can best improve not only the general average population in terms of performance, but also targeted to the low performing, the low ACS student. But if you look in the past 25, a quarter of a century of the policy intervention, you can see on the top the top part of the slide, there are so many committees and offices established to tackle this PISA outcome from the government perspective. And on the lower part of the slide, you can see that there are a lot of intervention talked about PISA-like tests, prepare the student or teacher training to practice the PISA-style test before the next PISA round coming in. So there's a question that, is this the only policy option that we should try in this country? That are there any other alternative policy options? So the only way we try to do this is through research. So we ask ourselves that in terms of population structure in our education system, we have about 9 million children in our education system in 30,000 schools across the country. There are about 15% of the population who are living under poverty in the country. So that's not the only part of our concern. Those disadvantaged children who are in the 15 years old, taking PISA in their ninth grade, more or less, they're likely to drop out right after took the PISA test, like the compulsory school age finished at the 15 years old in Thailand. So 20% of them drop out right after the compulsory school age, and another nearly 70% drop out after the high school. So there are only 12% of disadvantaged students who can actually enter college. And this gap between performance also still reflects in the university exams, where the disadvantaged children perform much less than the general population. So with that, we want to have an individual record of PISA. So the only way we can do that is to participate in PISA for school exercise with the OECD. And I would like to invite you to explain about the result of the research that we utilize this data.
Thank you. So I will be quick since it's over lunch. I have an opportunity to participate in PISA for school. We call PISA-based test for school, PBTS. That's the full name. So actually we did it twice. Once is in 2020, right during the COVID. So we closed the country so we can do that. But most of the result today will be the new round. It's in 2023, just last year, and then the result is now. So we done it during December 2023 and to January 2024. So since this is a work that we are working with the EEF, which is an organization that have a mandate to really help improve in education inequality in the country. So with that mandate in mind, so we over-target the disadvantaged students. So, and you will see in the PISA score that we have, and that show up that the score of the PISA from this group will be slightly even lower than the national average. Okay, and actually we have about 5,600, 700 students tested during this PBTS test. So here's a PISA score in Thailand. I zoom in a little bit more. This is just math. So you can see reading is, trending even more, downward even more. But I'm just going to show you math here just because I don't have much time. But the story is very similar. So you can see the red line is this is the PBTS test. You see that the trend is similar, but it's slightly below. Even we have low score in 2022, but we even have lower here. And I would convince you that this is because we target disadvantaged students. So how can we know that? So first, we can look at the distribution of, I create a wealth index from assets data from PISA. And we use the same variables in PISA and PBTS. And we can see that the PBTS has more proportion of students who were, in the lower tail of the wealth. So it's like the bottom 25 is here, so this is a PBTS is much higher than the PISA in general. So you can see that that's part of the impact. And then you can, here, if you focus on only bottom 25 students, you can see that no much different, especially if you focus on students who have level 4 and above. You see that it's very tiny proportion of students who can perform at that level, given they are at the bottom 25, no matter what test they are in. The PISA 2018 or 2023, 2022 or PBTS. They are very, very similar. So first, you can see that wealth, I mean, socioeconomic status matters a lot. And now I want to show you next one, and which would be our main results from research is, so I'm going to take the PISA PBTS score, and I'm going to run a simple regression. As many people have said here, this is correlation. I mean, it's going to be difficult to claim any causality as usual. But what we have in extra and an additional thing that we have here is, since the PISA for school is more, I mean, we know exactly what which student is testing. And then in this PISA for school, we run a separate household survey. So we send the questionnaire to the household, to the parent. So we ask them for consent that would they allow us to link this score with the children prior scores in the national test when they were performing that test in primary 6. So that's our primary school, like we have 1 to 6. So we have prior skills. So that's, I would call it prior skills. So it's like they have like 3 years before. So now it's not the cross-sectional anymore. So this is longitudinal data, okay? And I'm gonna run 2 regressions basically. So the first one with our prior skills. I'm gonna show you mostly the size of these estimation coefficient in graphs, this beta, okay? Whatever variable that I look at, I will see how big of this the coefficient. And then I will show the same coefficient when I added prior skills. So my key argument here is going to be very simple. Most of the skill or competency that they got to the PISA really come from primary school. So first, let me show this first. So to convince you that the PISA for school test is really comparable to PISA test. And then that's what the OECD is work. I mean, they did by design, everything it should be, but I'm going to confirm it's here by looking at the effect of wealth, because that's the first thing we worry about at EAF. So you can see that the blue one is a coefficient from using all the PISA score that we have from 2018, 2022, 2020 PBTS, and 2023 PBTS. We pull all of them together, run a simple regression, and just show you this blue line. So 2 means this is a, and then I divided wealth into 10 groups. 1, 2, and then, I mean, 10 deciles. And then the 2 means the effect of decile 2 relative to decile 1. And then everything is relative to decile 1 here, okay? And you can see this is a very nice curve in general. I mean, first you can see that wealth is really taking an effect more and more when the wealth is high. So at the low level, you don't see much. But at the upper, it's a big difference. On top of that, and it is very important here, is the pink one. The pink one is the one that we focus only on the PBTS 2023. And it's only the one that we can link with the prior skill data. That would count for like 3,000 samples. Okay, we have down to 3,000 samples, but you can see they are very comparable, I would say that. I mean, so now we're gonna look at, so those first 2 is the same regression, no prior skill or whatsoever. So it's just the first regression. Now I'm going to show you first and second regression using the same data set. These are 3,000 students. The pink one is the same. The green one is a new one. The green one is the one when we add primary 6 score of the children in there. So in Thailand, we have national tests. The student in primary 6 is going to be tested in math, science, Thai language, and then also English. So I put all separate 4 scores in here. And it doesn't matter, you can put the composite index there. It's gonna be the same. So, and you can see the difference between the pink and the green. The wealth effect after you control for the primary 6 score is like, I mean, still there, but very, very, very small relatively. And that means whatever happened, if the wealth really matter, it's really matter in already before we have PISA test. The same thing if you care. So here in Thailand, we have different type of schools. STEM school here means a very special school that we created to promote STEM education. It's very specialized, very subsidized. And you can see they have, before we control for prior skill, the impact is very high for being in this school. But once you control for that, it's still significant, but much, much lower. So again, It's really about selection of the kid into those schools. Because the score under the competency that we really care about in PISA, mostly, I mean not all, but it's likely that built or created in primary school. You can look at classroom disruption because there's those kind of questions in PISA. It's very nice, and you can see, oops, sorry. Those impact is become very small after you control for prior skills. So my main message is very simple. Primary schools skills or primary school quality matters a lot for PISA scores. And whatever we want to do to improve this competency, I believe that we're going to need to focus more on primary school, not the we have to improve secondary school, but we cannot ignore primary school anymore. And I will leave it to Grayot to talk about policy at the end.
Yep, just one last slide. I have to thank OECD to allow us to participate in this numerous programs in the past 10 years, and using this data and link it to the past performance of the student can actually uncover a promising long-term policy focus. If we focus not only the short-term program like tutoring or PISA-like tests, practicing or teacher training only in the last 1 or 2 years before the next PISA cycle, it might have some impact, but it might be minimal. But if you look back to the primary school and try to reduce inequality at the student level and at the school level and aim for the longer term, 5 years or 10 years, it might have a much stronger impact, which we will follow in the near future. And we also think that there should be some assessment at the primary school level that help us make sure that we did reduce the inequality between performance of the student and the school itself, so we can then link the policy implication to the future. And this new forecast should help the government, particularly Thai government, to have a broader policy options, not only on the short-term side, but also on the long-term side. And we hope this evidence also convince other government in other countries that to improve PISA is not just for the score itself, but for improve the livelihood and the prospect of the student for the long-term economic prosperity. And you have to have a longer view to do this in the right way. So that's our evidence. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. So we will go straight to questions. I will pick up, we have 50 minutes, I think, so perhaps 3, and we'll check online also. Yes, we'll start with Martin. But you need to use it.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Yeah, 3 really interesting presentations. I'm interested in your identification of groups. So if we take Flanders, you might be looking at the ability to look at a group like Roma and be able to identify them. But you talked about working class kids or underclass kids, you might say, that how you might label them or be able to identify them in order to carry the policy. In England, you've got free school meals as a sort of a way of identifying where the biggest areas of poverty are. How can you get better tools in order to make sure the policy that you're focused on is moving in that direction? And for the last presentation, I was really reassured that in the end you said, we don't want to teach to the test because it's a sampling assessment, so that's not the point. The point is how you can change the system. And I thought those points across all 3 sections about how you can identify the policies that pick up the biggest areas of poverty and underperformance are really important. So I don't know if it's that clear, but I'm after an identification of how to tighten those ways of identifying that group.
So this is another question. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a question for Emily, which I think is about causality ultimately. So I was wondering if you also thought about including other countries that didn't have EPPs, and also why you picked 2022 and perhaps not 2018, because from an earlier question, I gathered that in Flanders there was additional policies that targeted actually the disadvantaged groups. So I was wondering how you can ascribe the increase or the decrease in difference between the groups to the policy measures that you looked at in the study.
So I think we may have time for another question. If some, do you want? Yes, please go ahead. And then we'll check for online questions before sending to
Yes, sorry for asking again. But to me, it was very interesting to see the presentation from Thailand, because your findings that these massive gains in or let's say the root cause for these massive differences in skills along the social background, they originate from primary education. So we found the same in Germany. But we now, for a couple of years, have evidence that from longitudinal analysis that the main differences in competences along the social economic background originate from preschool education or care, so from the ECC sector. And we now try to tackle that, but that proves very difficult because the mindset in that area is completely different. So have you already thought, to add a question to that, have you already thought about looking into preschool education? Thank you.
So thank you, Samaya. There's any question? No? So we'll start by Emily, and Idibas can also join in answering the questions if needed. One there. You can use that one.
So I think first of all with the indicators, I think in general in the Flemish community we have language spoken at home. We have things like whether or not the kid have a scholarship. So we have several indicators, but it's quite hard to measure it with the PISA data because they don't have the indicators. I think one of the best things that could happen would be that you could link data, national data with PISA data, and you can do research in that way, because I think that would be way more precise in the groups. This is just a proxy, so it is a disadvantage of the study that you need to face. But I think in general, if we could ever link the data for several countries, the national data, that it would be a much more precise result with regards to the indicators. And then with causality, I don't really think that I claim that there is causality. Sorry, right? Because I think it's quite hard in this case to really say it's causality. There's so many things that happen in between those periods. A lot of policy shifts, contextual things, and you can't really account for all of it. So I think the best way to look at it is like it's a trend at the same period. So likely it will be due to the fact that if a policy is focusing on reducing equity or reducing inequity, and at the same time there is a reduce of inequity, you could assume it's linked to it. But we don't know for sure. But I did also run analysis with 2003, for example, for Flemish community, 2003, 2015, and 2003, 2018, to kind of know that the results were similar for each year. So for Flemish community, it was exactly the same. It was very similar. For England, it was the one that stood out because England didn't show any significant decreases in inequity, let's say, for 2022 with the first year, but it did show in 2015 and 2018. So that did make me wonder if there is something that happened during COVID that might have impacted the decrease in inequity that did take place before.
So I will ask the boss.
The first name is Ides. You can call me Ides. The question about the use of national indicators for priority policies versus the PISA indicators is an interesting question, because behind that question is the more fundamental issue: which one is the better indicator? Are we sure that the national indicators used for priority policies are good indicators? In the Flemish case, there is quite some overlap between the two, because we use both education of the mother and the language spoken at home, variables that are available in PISA. So we can have some degree of overlap between the two. but it's not necessarily the case that the national indicators are perfect. So it's good to test the validity of these indicators against a more internationally accepted kind of variables. And I would like to make a comment on the Irish case in this context, because I was involved in the recent OECD review of the DESH scheme in Ireland. And one of the discussion points is whether DESH actually uses the correct indicators or not. Because paradoxically, we find, and I think Lorraine will confirm this, that the gap between DESH and non-DESH schools was found to be reduced across time, but not the gap between low SES and high SES students at large. So that means that there's no congruence between the national identifiers used and internationally accepted variables. So this remains a discussion point. Would you like to add?
Let's go to Tai, and then Lorraine can have comment about this.
Okay, just quickly. I agree that preschool might be very important and might be crucial to this. Our result cannot go that far. Actually, I should say whatever happened before this 15 years old matters a lot. And it would be nice if you have a report, and I would love to see that report, because in our country, we still need longer time to collect those data and then look at that. Thank you.
So Lorraine, do you want to?
So I think just to follow up on what Ida said, I think in our analysis where we looked at school average ESCS versus school average HP, it was positive to see the correlations between those. I think we have a limited amount of administrative data in Ireland, so that's why it was useful to do the PISA analysis. In the most recent DESH identification, we are using traveller and Roma status at the individual student level, as well as whether or not the student lives in homeless accommodation and whether or not they live in international protection accommodation. So I think that has gone some way towards addressing some of the issues around whether or not we're using the best indicators. But I think there's always ongoing discussion about, are there ways to improve it further? Some attention has been given to whether or not we could use crime data. That wasn't possible at the time it was examined, but there are opportunities in the future perhaps to revisit other alternative variables, and we're certainly open to that.
So I will check with Samoya, but I think we still have time for, yeah. So one or two questions, something that or comment. We can also accept comments.